Attorney General now who's refusing to testify to the House Judiciary Committee. Now, President Trump tonight is saying he won't allow anyone who has worked in his administration to testify, even if they're no longer working in his administration. And that might include Robert Mueller. NBC News is reporting tonight that the House Judiciary Committee has now begun discussions directly with Robert Mueller's team about coming to testify to the committee, but nothing has been finalized at this point and no date has been set. The Judiciary Committee has been seeking Robert Mueller's testimony through the normal Justice Department process, which requires the permission of the Attorney General, but that permission might never come now. The president told Fox News tonight that he will try to block former White House counsel Don McGahn's testimony to the House Judiciary Committee. The president said, "I don't think I can let him, especially him, because he was a counsel." The president falsely claimed that he has given investigators total transparency, and then he said, "It's done."
So is it done?
I would say it's done. We've been through this. Nobody has ever done what I've done. I've given total transparency. It's never happened before like this.
So Congress shouldn't be
looking anymore. This is all. It's done.
The Attorney General refused to testify to the House Judiciary Committee today because of what he called, quote, Chairman Nadler's insistence on having staff question the Attorney General. The Attorney General called that unprecedented. But as I said, later in this hour, we will show you a video history of committee staff asking questions in congressional hearings, including President Trump's favorite lawyer, Roy Cohn, who actually became a famous lawyer who Donald Trump wanted to hire because Roy Cohn was allowed to ask questions in high-profile hearings as a staff attorney. There were more calls for the Attorney General's resignation today, and our first guest tonight, Congressman Eric Swalwell, has called for the Attorney General's impeachment. Eric Swalwell is not the first member of the House to call for the Attorney General Barr to be impeached. The House Banking Chairman, Henry Gonzalez, called for the impeachment of Attorney General William Barr 27 years ago in William Barr's first tour of duty as Attorney General for Republican President George H.W. Bush. William Barr has been through all of this before, accusations of dishonesty, accusations of being part of a cover-up, calls for his resignation, calls for his impeachment. The people who urged Donald Trump to choose William Barr as his Attorney General knew William Barr had survived all of that once before and would know how to handle it once again. Democrats controlled the House and the Senate in 1992 and were outraged at William Barr's handling of an investigation of the administration, which included an investigation of the conduct of the FBI and the Justice Department. So William Barr was actually supervising then an investigation of himself. And as I reported on this program recently, New York Times columnist William Safire on October 19th, 1992, called Attorney General William Barr the cover-up general because of the way he handled that investigation. William Safire was a conservative Republican columnist in the New York Times in those days. He had worked as a speechwriter for Republican President Richard Nixon. And even William Safire was astonished by William Barr's conduct as Attorney General. But if Bill Safire was still with us tonight, he would not be surprised to hear what the Speaker of the House said today about Attorney General William Barr.
What is deadly serious about it is the Attorney General of the United States of America was not telling the truth to the Congress of the United States. That's a crime.
Remarkably, after the Speaker of the House said that's a crime, the next reporter's question actually changed the subject, but MSNBC's Casey Hunt knew a history-making comment by a Speaker of the House when she heard one, and 2 minutes later, Casey Hunt went back to the crime.
Madam Speaker, did the Attorney General commit a crime?
He lied to Congress. He lied to Congress. If anybody else did that, it would be considered a crime. Nobody is above the law, not the President of the United States and not the Attorney General. Being the Attorney General does not give you a bath to go say whatever you want, and it is the fact because you are the Attorney General.
Should he go to jail? Should he go to jail for it?
There's a process involved here, and as I said, I'll say it again, and how many other questions you may have, the committee will act upon how we will proceed.
Politico reported today that in a closed-door session with the Democratic members of the House of Representatives this morning, Speaker Pelosi told Florida Congressman Charlie Crist, "We saw Barr commit a crime when he answered your question." Here is the moment the Speaker was talking about.
Reports have emerged recently, General, that members of the special counsel's team are frustrated at some level with the limited information included in your March 24th letter, that it does not adequately or accurately necessarily portray the report's findings. Do you know what they're referencing with that?
No, I don't.
No one knew it then, but we now know that William Barr was in possession of a letter of complaint signed by Special Counsel Robert Mueller. And according to William Barr's guessing yesterday in the Senate Judiciary Committee, that letter was written by the Special Counsel's team.
You know, the letter's a bit snitty, and I think it was probably written by one of his staff people.
That was a major blunder in his under oath testimony yesterday, because William Barr has been claiming that because Congressman Crist used the phrase the special counsel's team, that didn't mean the special counsel himself. And so he did not have to reveal then that he was in possession of a letter of complaint from the special counsel's team, as he put it. But you just heard the Attorney General say that he believed that that letter wasn't even written by Robert Mueller, just signed by Robert Mueller, which means it was the product in the Attorney General's mind at that time of the special counsel's team. The White House released a letter today to Attorney General William Barr from a White House counsel who is designated to defend the president in investigations. The letter was written the day after the redacted Mueller report was publicly released. And among other things, the letter stresses that although the president waived executive privilege and allowed White House counsel Don McGahn and other members of his administration to voluntarily testify to the special counsel, that waiver of executive privilege does not extend to any other investigation. The president's lawyer's letter says his decision not to assert privilege is not a waiver of executive privilege for any other material or for any other purpose. His decision to permit disclosure of executive privilege portions of the report does not waive any privileges or protections for the special counsel's office underlying investigative materials, such as, for example, FBI Form 302 witness interview summaries and presumptively privileged documents made available to the special counsel's office by the White House. His decision does not affect his ability as president to instruct his advisors to decline to appear before congressional committees to answer questions on these same subjects. Leading off our discussion tonight is Democratic Congressman Eric Swalwell of California. He's a member of the Judiciary Committee and the House Intelligence Committee, and he is also a candidate for president. Congressman Swalwell, I first of all want to get your reaction to the Attorney General's refusal to testify today.
Good evening, Lawrence. I believe it's clear why he didn't want to come in. He has a lot to hide. This Attorney General has had the shovels out, finishing off the burial of evidence to protect this president. He was allowed to play a home game yesterday, essentially in front of a friendly Senate with Chairman Graham. But today he was facing the new majority that the American people had put in place to put this balance of power on these abuses of power. He wasn't willing to come in. He'll stand on process objections, but the American people will judge him by whether he showed up or he didn't. And when he was supposed to come and talk about what the Russians did in our election and who they worked with on the Trump team, the Trump campaign, the Trump businesses, he was unwilling to do that. And he's going to be held responsible and accountable for that.
And so what is next? How is he going to be held responsible?
Well, I'm urging my colleagues to move forward with impeachment proceedings. And Lawrence, I don't take that lightly. I called on him to resign a couple of weeks ago, and I've long been concerned about his conduct. First, he prejudged the investigation before he even got the job with the letter that he sent to the Deputy Attorney General. Second, when he took the job, he accused falsely the prior administration of spying on the Trump campaign. Third, the way that he mischaracterized at the press conference the Mueller findings, that there was no collusion when in fact there was evidence of collusion, and also stated that Mueller was unable to find obstruction because of different things that Mueller laid out, but didn't note that Mueller noted that it was the Office of Legal Counsel finding that you can't indict a president, which also stood in the way. And then finally, Lawrence, just in the last 2 weeks, finding out that he lied to Congress, to Congressman Crist, and yesterday missed the deadline when we asked him with the lawful subpoena to deliver the documents of the Mueller report. Time after time, he's protected the president, acted as his lawyer. The only way to stop that and get the documents we need, have a rule of law, is to move to impeach and ultimately remove him.
Isn't that Congress taking the eye off the ball, though, since the Mueller report is about the president? Wouldn't it be a sidetrack to go after William Barr?
We have to do all of that. We have to continue to understand what the Russians are doing, hold accountable the person who won't give us the information we need, because, an eighth of the Mueller report is redacted. And if we're going to hold the president accountable and put reforms in place so the Russians can't do this, we need to see the full report. And if he's going to be a live, real-time obstructor, we have to move to get him out of the way, essentially, so that we can get what we need. And again, people talk about, well, are you going to impeach the president? Is that on the table? Yes, of course, that's on the table. We're looking at his conduct right now. But if he has someone who is standing guard and not following the law and turning over the documents that we need, then we're not going to be able to get that. And he's effectively allowing the president to get off scot-free. So he needs to be held accountable.
Let me go to a point that Rachel raised just at the end of her hour. I don't know if you heard that, but about the new staffing on the Intelligence Committee that you're a part of, and the way the chairmanship is adding to the staff of the committee. What can you tell us about that, and what does it mean?
This is the staff that we needed 2 years ago, Lawrence. The Republicans, in the thick of this investigation, right after we found out about the attack, would not allow us to add staff or investigators that would look at the money. And so we were in a hole for 2 years. But our committee and our staff worked hard to elevate the issue and the public awareness. And now we have these experts on the beat, so to speak. And we are looking at the financial aspect of this. Chairman Schiff and I and others suspected that Mueller was not able to look at the financial compromise of the president, which again calls into question whether you can really charge somebody or not charge somebody with conspiracy if you don't understand the financial entanglements. We are looking at those financial entanglements. We are taking an MRI to the financial records of the Trump family, businesses, and campaign.
Congressman Eric Swalwell, thank you very much for starting us off tonight. And later in the hour, we'll do the presidential campaign interview. So please stay with us. We are joined now by Chuck Rosenberg. He's a former senior official at the FBI and a former U.S. attorney. He was counsel to Robert Mueller at the FBI. He's an MSNBC legal analyst. And Chuck, when I read this letter today from the White House counsel to the Attorney General, I just wanted you on the phone immediately. So they're saying that even though there was a waiver of executive privilege to allow all these White House staff people to freely discuss whatever the special prosecutor asked about, that waiver doesn't extend to any congressional committee, doesn't extend anywhere else at all.
Mr. Flood, Emmett Flood, counsel to the president, who wrote the letter, makes a pretty nuanced and difficult argument. He said the president decided not to assert the privilege, but that failure to assert, or the decision not to assert the privilege, is not the same as waiving the privilege. So it's not a crazy argument. It's not frivolous, but I don't think it prevails. The better argument, I think, and you'll hear it from the other side, is that if you waive as to one, you waive as to all. But here's the problem. In order to get to that answer, it's going to have to be litigated, and you know better. What's the timetable?
So obviously what happens is they subpoena Don McGahn, and the president says no executive privilege, and then that goes to court. That subpoena, in effect, goes to court. How long does that take to work it out?
That's exactly right. It goes to a federal district court, and whoever loses there will inevitably appeal to the Court of Appeals, and someone will lose there, and they might take the appeal to the Supreme Court, which may or may not hear it.
3 months between each one of those stages, or possibly more?
Possibly more. I mean, it could be 12 plus months, and that's part of the strategy, right? So you don't have to advance a winning argument. You just have to advance an argument credible enough to prolong the process.
And litigation is something Donald Trump has always used as a tactic without necessarily believing he could even win.
100% right. We saw that time and time again when it was businessman Donald Trump in Manhattan. And there, often, you had somebody on the other side who couldn't afford to wage that legal battle. That won't happen here. Both sides will be able to mount their arguments in court. But nevertheless, if you're just trying to run out the clock, this is a way to do it.
Your reaction to the Attorney General refusing to show up at the House Judiciary Committee today?
We need to hear from our Attorney General. Now, we also need to hear the truth from our Attorney General, and that appears to be two different things. But I was disappointed. The Department of Justice has a critical role in this society, the Attorney General, whether you like him or not, at its helm. And he should be there to answer questions in the people's house. I mean, that's part of his job. I imagine he will get there one way or the other. They may not like one another, but he has to sit in that chair and answer questions.
Well, he has to by tradition.
Correct.
But the tradition does not seem to hold with President Trump or with this Attorney General now.
Right. But Congress has a few cards to play. For instance, purse strings. They are the appropriators. There are things that a Department of Justice needs from a Congress. And so one way or another, he's going to have to go there and answer their questions eventually.
But they are two different committees. We actually already saw him testify to the Appropriations Committee, that's a very different experience than testifying to the Judiciary Committee.
That's right. I still predict he will show up there eventually. I'm just sorry he wasn't there today because these are important questions. Just like the litigation, which would delay the questions to which we need answers, you want answers now. And you need the Attorney General there now. These are too important to put off.
And quickly, Robert Mueller's testimony, are they going to be able to block that?
Well, so an interesting question. If it's Bob Mueller, private citizen, of course he can go testify. However, there are still limitations on it. He can't talk about grand jury information. He can't talk about classified information. He can't talk about ongoing matters. So once he's a private citizen, he's welcome to go, but he's still not welcome to talk about things that are otherwise restricted.
Chuck Rosenberg, thank you very much for joining us tonight. Really appreciate it.
My pleasure.
And when we come back, President Trump might be just as worried about losing re-election as he is about losing legal battles. Because if he loses, he has a lot of free time to deal with things like, indictments.
Hi, it's Katie Tur. Want to keep up with MSNBC while you're on the go? Subscribe to the MSNBC Daily Newsletter. You'll get the best of what you've missed during this unprecedented era of news. Text MSNBC to 66866 to subscribe.
The polls get worse for President Trump every day. He has the most consistently strong disapproval rating in the history of presidential polling. And a new poll today shows most of the top-tier Democratic candidates with significant leads over Donald Trump in one-on-one polls against him. And so there is a very strong chance that he will not be president of the United States on the afternoon of the next inauguration day, according to what we know from the polls now. And if that happens, Donald Trump will have a lot of free time to deal with things like being indicted. 3 weeks ago at this hour, I reminded you that Donald Trump is an unindicted co-conspirator in the Southern District of New York with Michael Cohen, who pleaded guilty to federal election crimes that he said he committed with Donald Trump and at Donald Trump's direction, and that they committed those crimes together to win the presidential campaign in what the prosecutors called a conspiracy against the United States of America, and that all of that is still sitting in the Southern District of New York, waiting for Donald Trump after the next inauguration day. That's the point I made then. And now the former U.S. attorney for the Southern District of New York is saying the same thing in a smarter way. In an interview with the Daily Beast, Preet Bharara said, "My former office clearly endorses and believes the fact, as Michael Cohen admitted in open court, that he engaged in the conduct he pleaded guilty to at the direction of Individual One. Individual One is the president. Depending on what the other circumstances are, I believe there's a reasonable likelihood that they would follow through on that." The man who thinks he's the smartest staff person in the Trump White House proved once again today that there is no good way of defending Donald Trump. Emmett Flood, the White House counsel who is assigned to defending the president in every investigation, is the author of a letter that was released by the White House today, presumably because Emmett Flood and the White House think it is very helpful to the president. It is a letter, as we just mentioned in the previous segment, to Attorney General William Barr. It was written the day after the redacted Mueller report was released. It is a letter of complaint about Robert Mueller and the Mueller report. And its biggest complaint biggest complaint is that Robert Mueller in the report says that the special counsel could not exonerate the president in its investigation of obstruction of justice by the president. And the president's lawyer does not insist that the special counsel could exonerate the president. You'd think that's what his complaint is. Why didn't he exonerate the president? The president's lawyer actually says that it is impossible to exonerate the president. Emmett Flood's letter says the special counsel's office concluded that the evidence prevented it from conclusively determining that no criminal conduct occurred, but conclusively determining that no criminal conduct occurred was not the special counsel's office assigned task, because making conclusive determinations of innocence is never the task of the federal prosecutor. Prosecutors simply are not in the business of establishing innocence. And so the president's own lawyer took the position in that letter that the Mueller report did not establish the president's innocence on anything. So when Donald Trump stands up in the presidential campaign and says he was exonerated, the Democrats can wave the president's lawyer's letter saying that he wasn't. Joining our discussion now, Neera Tanden, president of the Center for American Progress, and Jason Johnson, politics editor at TheRoot.com and a professor of politics at media at Morgan State University. And Neera, begin where you want to, because there's so much going on here.
I mean, my take on the letter is that Emmett Flood probably presumed that because there's so many big words in the letter, Donald Trump was never going to read it.
Oh, of course he hasn't. Right. Yeah, he doesn't know that.
So he thought maybe he'd just get by on that. But I think you've seen, this is the latest example of the ways in which the administration has essentially argued themselves into a bag. You saw all throughout the Attorney General's testimony yesterday how he couldn't even articulate clearly without some prompting that if the Russians come or another country comes and tries to sway the election, actually as a candidate, you might want to let the FBI know. I mean, the Attorney General of the United States has to go through mental gymnastics on an issue like that, which just tells you how, Kafkaesque this whole debate is. And what we should really recognize is that we have a president who is continually working to obstruct any investigation. And generally speaking, when you're trying to obstruct investigations, it shows that you're guilty, not that you're innocent. That's the bottom line, I think, for most Americans.
So, Jason, what I was struck by is it's a legal letter. And the legal point it wants to make is we are not extending the waiver of executive privilege beyond the Mueller investigation. Okay, that's the legal point. Right. But it's a political letter. This was written to help the president politically, help the president's reelection campaign. And in the part where he's trying to help the most by attacking the Mueller report, he is actually saying you could never prove Donald Trump innocent of anything.
It's funny. It's like, you accuse him of being a liar, a thief, and a murderer. He is not a liar, right? That's essentially what they're saying here. And the problem is, it's hard to keep track of all these lies. Like these are individuals who have worked in D.C., they've worked in Congress, they've worked as lobbyists for years, and they may be used to sort of fudging the truth, but the level of mendacity that you have to engage in to work for this guy is actually beyond them. I am impressed that they're still incapable of lying the way that they want to lie. They'll get better at it, but this letter is an example of how even someone using the spiciest of word salads can't find a way to justify their boss keeping his job.
As evidenced by the fact that, you have Kamala Harris finding from the Attorney General that he didn't look at any of the underlying evidence. Yes. I mean, as Americans, we expect prosecutors to actually look at the basic evidence behind a case. The fact that he's unable to do that because his job was not to find what to do here. His job was to protect the president. I mean, the president basically put his own lawyer in charge of this investigation. Jason,
these one-on-one polls are fascinating. They're early. Right. We grant that. They're early. But there's a consistent pattern that you see in those polls. And they line up and they make intuitive sense with a president who has always had significant majority disapproval, right, that he would be running behind any reasonable sounding candidates.
So that's the issue. Reasonable, right? they all sound reasonable now. Will they sound reasonable at this point next year? I was looking at some polls around May of 2011, right before, Obama was up for re-election. Trump was actually ahead, even though he hadn't announced in some polls at that particular point. So we can't always trust what these polls are saying now. But what this speaks to, and I've said this before, Lawrence, Trump has the weakest fundamentals of any president in history for re-election. You lost a popular vote by 3 million. Your approval has always been below 50%. And every swing state that you won swung back blue hard during your first midterm. He is starting from a deficit. He doesn't just have a headwind. I mean, this guy is climbing over rocks and mountains to get there. I don't know if that means that the Democrat can pull it off. We'll have to see who the final nominee is. But Donald Trump is not in a very strong position. And I objectively think any of the top 4 or 5 Democrats who are running right now, if they're smart, if they pick the right kind of VP, could probably pull off a victory, assuming that Trump and this administration don't cheat, which we can't.
I think the one way that he is planning to win, I would agree that the fundamentals are definitely against him, and that he, he's, as many have said, he's the president of his base. He's not the president of the country. He's done nothing to reach out to the middle or to the, 51% of the country so far. It's consistently has 50% or 55 or 58 against him. So it's a little unusual politics, but I do think his plan is to destroy the Democratic nominee. And I think he'll play psychological warfare in the Democratic primary. So I do think Democrats have to be mindful of who the candidate he wants is. Who can he go after? That's the only thing I would add to that.
See, here's the thing about that. I never believe, first off, this guy's got terrible political instincts, right? So I don't trust anything that Donald Trump has to say. You lost the popular vote before. But I think this idea that we have to be careful about how he destroys people. Donald Trump's, this sort of high school game that he plays of coming up with nicknames, it only works for his base. I mean, I don't think it necessarily has much of a pervasive impact. And I wouldn't trust, it's like if ask an athlete, which team do you want to face? They're never going to tell you the truth. Who Donald Trump is, it's like, do you really want to face the Lakers? Do you want to face Golden State? I don't think Trump really knows. He just knows who he's paying attention to right now. The people that he dismisses, like Beto O'Rourke could actually be really dangerous. Even his own advisors don't know who's the most dangerous.
He does very well in this poll.
Yeah.
Neera, you've worked in presidential campaigns. Here's the way I've been watching the Trump re-election campaign. And presidential re-election campaigns are actually supposed to begin on the election night when you win. Your victory speech is supposed to be at least partially directed at the people who didn't vote for you. Okay.
That is usually the case.
In my watching of the Trump re-election campaign, I have never once seen him try to reach a voter who did not already vote for him. And so the way I look at the Trump campaign is, what did he do to convince a voter to change their mind and vote for Donald Trump today? And I've never seen that day happen.
Yeah, that day has never happened. I do think he tries to use fear to scare people. I think the caravan was about trying to scare people, maybe women in the suburbs, who knows. But here's the thing, it didn't work. That's the issue. He lost historically in the midterms. 9 million more people voted for Democrats than for him. So what is he doing day to day to actually get some of those people back? Nothing. I mean, very little. His whole strategy is to just bring more people out from the base. And I think that's a shaky category, because here's the thing. He's no longer the change agent. He's the incumbent. He can't promise new change in Washington. He has to go on what he's done. So far, he's only passed one major bill, and it was a tax cut that basically no one in America feels except for the top 1%, not his base.
And now he's fighting in court to take health care away from 21 million people.
Right, which is not going to be popular.
I don't see that helping the campaign.
No. And here's the particularly scary part. All of this bad news, all of these bad poll numbers, losing in the midterms, everything else like that, that's with a good economy.
Yeah.
Yes,
what happens if this slows down?
There's
just a snowball's chance in Jamaica that he's going to be able to pull this off if this economy ends up slowing down. And one other thing I'll say, we've sort of talked about this before. Who would be the most effective at beating him? The most effective person for the Democrats to beat Donald Trump is the person who gets the most people enthusiastic. Mm-hmm. You can't line this up one-on-one, right? There's no statistical measure. It's got to be the candidate that gets the most people enthusiastic, because the greatest danger in Trump getting reelected is not because people fail to turn out to vote. It's because they fail to believe that the challenger is going to actually change and undo the things that he's done.
All right, we've got to squeeze in a break here. Neera Tanden and Jason Johnson, thank you both very much for joining us here tonight. Really appreciate it. And coming up later in the hour, we have new video of Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez preparing for her televised debate in her successful congressional campaign last year. And her preparation at that point was not about memorizing talking points. As mentioned in the last segment, new polling today shows that President Trump is losing in one-on-one matchups with several of the leading Democratic presidential candidates. A new CNN poll shows Beto O'Rourke with the largest lead over the president, with O'Rourke at 52% and Trump at 42%. Joe Biden leads the president in the one-on-one polling with 51% to 45%. Senator Bernie Sanders polled at 50% to Trump's 44%. Senator Kamala Harris polled ahead of Donald Trump at 49 to 45%. Mayor Pete Buttigieg polled at 47% with the president at 44%. And Senator Elizabeth Warren polled within 1 point of the president, which is a statistical tie within the margin of error. At this point, in 2007, in the campaign for the Democratic presidential nomination, Joe Biden was polling at only 3% against Hillary Clinton, Barack Obama, and John Edwards. And in the end, Joe Biden came in second. There is a second place in presidential campaigns. It's called Vice President of the United States. And almost all of the candidates running are solid possibilities for the vice presidential nomination. And it's never too early to start thinking about who you'd like to see on the ticket with your favorite candidate. And that might start to become much clearer next month when we have the first Democratic presidential debates on this network. You can start looking at what your ideal ticket might look like then. Democratic Congressman Eric Swalwell is one of the candidates who has qualified to participate in that debate, and he will join us next for tonight's interview as one of the contenders. Joining us now, one of the 21 candidates for the Democratic presidential nomination, Congressman Eric Swalwell. Thank you very much, Congressman, for staying with us for this campaign discussion. I want to start with a question that some of the candidates, some of the men running have been asked, and it's that question of would you choose a woman as your vice presidential running mate? I'm going to ask you a different question. I'm going to ask, would you happily accept the nomination to run in the vice presidential slot with a woman at the top of the ticket?
Oh, I mean, of course. I'll do anything to serve my country, Lawrence.
And I want to go to issues that aren't being discussed very much these days, and using your experience on the Intelligence Committee. What do you see as the biggest threat in the world that the United States faces now?
Lawrence, I see the biggest threat being on the Intelligence Committee, meeting with foreign leaders, taking the classified briefings and going to the war zones, is that we have lost our friends in the world, and that's costing us more here at home. I'm a parent of 2 kids under 2, so I look at everything, in a parental metaphor. And if you look at our foreign policy, the way a parent would look at their kid on the playground, in the last couple of years, your child has gone from hanging out with the honor roll kids, traditional friends being the Brits and the French and the Australians, to now we roll with the detention crew. And it's not just bad company in the Russians and the North Koreans and the Turks and the Saudis. It's going to cost us more when you pull out of environmental treaties, when you pull out of nuclear treaties, when you can't count on NATO and the South Koreans and the Japanese, and you're threatening to charge them more for our presence over there. So that's the biggest threat right now, is that we are not able to count on our friends. And there's a cost for not having friends. It's going to be fewer tablets in the hands of our kids in their classrooms and more expensive prescription drugs for our seniors, because we're going to have to spend more on defense.
You began in the announcing of your presidential campaign focusing on the domestic threat of gun violence. What do you think you can realistically achieve legislatively on that if you're in the presidency?
Yeah, I'm offering a boldness on this issue. And in the first 100 days, I will ask the Congress to pass not only background checks, because 90% of Americans and 72% of NRA members want that, but also to ban and buy back the 15 million assault weapons, just like the one that was used in Poway last weekend and used in other church shootings and other school shootings. I've come to see, Lawrence, that this issue is actually not as divisive as we're told it's supposed to be. We're always told it's a hot stove, but that's a tactic that the NRA uses so that we do nothing. I'm motivated by the moms and the students and the parents who all converged in this last election and beat 17 NRA-endorsed members of Congress, and we're just getting started.
And Medicare for all?
Medicare for anyone who wants it. My plan is coverage for all, which would include a public option, but also would invest in cures in our lifetime. I want to challenge the country to seek and find cures through investments in genomic research, targeted therapies, as well as data sharing so that we could look at ALS and Parkinson's and cancer patients and assure them that we're putting the next generation of scientists to work to bring down the cost, extend the quality of life, and also have a massive jobs program.
So let me just explore this. Medicare for anyone who wants it, meaning they can buy into it?
Yeah, a public option, Lawrence. So if you like your union plan, you can keep your union plan, but the government will have a greater responsibility by bringing back the inheritance tax, reforming the capital gains tax, making sure that the wealthier pay their fair share. Those dollars will go into an affordable government plan.
And what about the Green New Deal?
I support it. We have 12 years to address the devastating effects of climate change. But the first thing I'll do is host in the United States a new climate accord, show leadership there, get us back into that agreement, but also assure that union worker who's a pipe fitter or a laborer that you don't have the false choice of deciding between your job and clean air and clean water, because we will make sure we deploy carbon capture, carbon sequestration, carbon reuse technologies to your job site. You can keep working because we'll bring those sites to carbon neutral, but also have a skills bridge to the new green collar economy in wind, solar, and alternative fuel cells. Again, I want to bring boldness where we've just seen incrementalism and gridlock.
How important do you think the issue of experience is for a candidate for president? You're running against possibly the most experienced candidate for president ever in Vice President Biden with a very long Senate career and then 8 years in the vice presidency. Bernie Sanders, very long congressional and Senate career. How do you compare your experience to theirs?
I've been on the Intelligence Committee. I've defended the threats to our democracy from abroad and the Russian interference attacks. People have seen where I've stood in that ring, but also defending the rule of law here at home on the Judiciary Committee and 7 years as a prosecutor and my hometown city councilman. I have some of the highest national security policy experience aside from Joe Biden in this field. But I also believe that not being in Congress for a lifetime, not being in Washington for a lifetime, also brings a perspective that will bring new energy and new ideas and a sunny optimism that we can still solve these big problems.
Presidential candidate Eric Swalwell, thank you very much for joining us.
Pleasure,
we will do
Lawrence.
this again.
Thank
there
you.
are a lot more issues to talk about, and we will definitely do it again. Thank you for joining us tonight.
Thank you.
And when we come back, how the most famous freshman member of Congress in history prepared for her campaign debate back when nobody really knew her outside of her congressional district. That's next. Last year, the then virtually unknown 28-year-old congressional candidate Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez seemed to be doing everything right in her congressional campaign, including the televised debate on local TV in New York City.
For over 20 years, the interests of working families have been sold off to luxury real estate developers, Wall Street banks, and for-profit healthcare corporations. And for 20 years, our rents have been going up, healthcare's been getting more expensive, and our incomes are staying the same. Not all Democrats are the same. And in a district that is overwhelmingly working class, we deserve a working class champion.
That was a scene from the new Netflix documentary, Knock Down the House, that became available on Netflix yesterday and is on my list for viewing this weekend. Here is a scene of the candidate at home preparing for that debate, which involved more than just studying talking points.
I can do this.
I know you do.
I am experienced enough to do this. I am knowledgeable enough to do this. I am prepared enough to do this. I am mature enough to do this. I am brave enough to do this. And this whole thing, this whole time, he's going to tell me I can't do this. He's going to tell me I'm small, that I'm little, that I'm young, that I'm inexperienced.
She really did push all of that away. After this final commercial break, we will take you on a quick video tour through the history of congressional hearings starring staff lawyers asking the questions in those hearings, something that the Attorney General is now pretending is unprecedented. That's next. As we reported earlier, the Attorney General of the United States refused to appear at a House Judiciary Committee hearing this morning because he objected to, quote, Chairman Nadler's insistence on having staff question the Attorney General. The Attorney General said that is, quote, unprecedented. In fact, there is a long history of committee staff, especially committee counsel, doing most of the questioning in both Senate hearings and House hearings. And that is one of the very few pieces of congressional history that Donald Trump actually knows, because Donald Trump's first lawyer was Roy Cohn, who became famous in congressional hearings. Roy Cohn was never elected to anything. Roy Cohn was a counsel to a committee, and he got to ask questions in the early days of televised hearings in the 1950s. That is how Donald Trump knew who Roy Cohn was. That is why Donald Trump and everyone else who hired Roy Cohn wanted Roy Cohn. They saw him on TV in those hearings. Here is a brief video history of some of the people who became big congressional hearing room TV stars by doing what the Attorney General of the United States now says is unprecedented, beginning with Bobby Kennedy in the 1950s, back when he was a committee staff lawyer.
During the period of the operation of this committee, we've had some testimony regarding an individual by the name of Mr. Glenn Smith.
You were employed on January 21st, 1969, and continue to be employed until March 14 of this year. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Mr. Butterfield, are you aware of the installation of any listening devices in the Oval Office of the President?
I was aware of listening devices. Yes, sir.
As soon as the President, who may have used his telephone, lifted up his telephone and engaged in a conversation or received a conversation on his President's phone, the recording device